Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com with another story from National Public Radio. Researchers can now explain how climate change is affecting your weather. Climate change makes every heat wave worse. Heat waves have the clearest connection to global warming. It seems obvious that as the global climate warms, heat waves would also warm. And in their article, they provided this chart. Heat waves are occurring in the U.S. more often than they used to. The frequency of heat waves has increased steadily each decade from an average of 2 heat waves per year during the 1960s to 6 per year during the 2010s. So let's take a look at why they began their chart in the 1960s and didn't include prior data. This graph from the National Climate Assessment shows that heat waves were least common during the 1960s and 1970s, and they were much more common prior to that. And not only was the length of heat waves much greater prior to 1960, but the intensity was also much larger. The National Climate Assessment reads, as with warm daily temperatures, heat wave magnitude reached a maximum in the 1930s. The frequency of intense heat waves has generally increased since the 1960s in most regions except the Midwest and the Great Plains. So NPR hid all the heat wave data prior to 1960, because had they included it, it would have wrecked NPR's entire story. In 1961, right at the beginning of the NPR chart, the New York Times reported there was unanimous agreement among scientists that Earth was getting colder. The National Center for Atmospheric Research showed in 1974 that there was a sharp decline in global temperatures from the early 1940s through the end of the 1960s. And they also showed that temperatures were cooler in 1970 than they were a century earlier in 1870. The leading experts in 1974 explained how droughts, floods, blizzards, tornadoes, typhoons, and hurricanes were caused by global cooling. Science News on March 1, 1975 was titled "The Ice Age Cometh" and showed glaciers plowing through Manhattan. 42 top American and European investigators met at Brown University and then sent a letter to President Nixon warning of a new ice age in about a century. So it's abundantly clear why NPR hid all the data before the 1960s. Let's take a closer look at the information NPR is hiding. Summer afternoons in the United States were much hotter prior to 1960, with 1936 being the hottest. This date in 1936, July 9th, was the hottest day on record in New York City. Central Park was officially 106 degrees Fahrenheit. The New York Times reported 7 die in near city. New York gasps in the highest temperature in Bureau's history. 50 persons prostrated. Mercury in Times Square at 115 degrees. Throngs sleep in streets, parks, and on beaches. No relief is promised. The summer percent of days above 95 degrees Fahrenheit or 35 degrees Celsius in the United States was much higher prior to 1960. Same story with 100-degree days. Recent years have been among the coolest on record. The percentage of the United States to reach 95 degrees Fahrenheit sometime during the summer has plummeted over the last 90 years to near record lows. So perhaps NPR is actually very nice, honest people, and they just didn't know that it used to be hot in the United States. But that doesn't appear to be the case. Here's an NPR article talking about the heat wave of 1896, which killed nearly 1,500 people in New York City. And it wasn't just New York that was hot in 1896. Southeast Australia had their hottest month on record during January 1896. The New York Times correctly reported on this, the hottest of hot waves on record, how it struck sweltering New South Wales in January last. The heat wave and drought, which began in 1896, killed 19 million people in India and 19.5 to 30 million people in China. And back in the United States again, 1896 may have been the worst year for tornadoes in U.S. history. According to the Tornado Project, there were at least 40 killer tornadoes in 1896, including the only one to cause more than 100 deaths in 2 separate cities. The most famous of these tornadoes occurred on May 27th and destroyed much of St. Louis. NPR is attempting to defraud the public, and their goal is to demonize fossil fuels. They want people to believe that the burning of fossil fuels is causing an increase in heat waves and generally an increase in bad weather. But the actual data shows the exact opposite. As carbon dioxide has increased in the atmosphere, the percent of the United States reaching 95 degrees Fahrenheit sometime during the summer has sharply decreased. And the frequency of hot days has also sharply decreased as the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has increased. This article from National Public Radio is grossly misleading and fraudulent. So who is paying them to misinform the public? Bill Gates has given nearly $25 million to National Public Radio and $13 million to The Guardian, another leading source of climate misinformation. Bill Gates wants to destroy the meat industry and is calling for government rules requiring people in rich countries to eat 100% synthetic beef. Bill Gates is trying to force this destruction of personal liberties and freedom under the guise of a climate disaster. And not surprisingly, Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos will make a lot of money if the destruction of the meat industry proceeds. They're both heavily invested in the fake meat industry. While the world was being impoverished by lockdowns during the year 2020, Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos both greatly increased their wealth. Their business model is based on profiting off of the misery of other people. Bezos spreads his climate misinformation through the Washington Post, and Bill Gates spreads it through NPR and The Guardian. Bill Gates uses NPR as his marketing department, which is why we see these sort of fraudulent articles day in and day out from NPR. Toto has been calling out these scamsters for the past 14 years. You can visit him, Kyrie Caesar, Toki and Upala on the web at realclimatescience.com.